to be having an important discussion about Lyndon LaRouche, and now with the long-awaited demise of Henry Kissinger, we can talk about why Henry Kissinger was obsessed with stopping Lyndon LaRouche and stopping his work. This is very urgent right now because you do have finally, at long last, the plight of the innocent people of Gaza who are being exterminated by the Israeli Defense Forces armed by the Biden administration. This has pricked the conscience of billions of people all over the world. This is not the first genocide that has occurred since World War II. Unfortunately, we have had many genocides, not the least of which was in Zaire, Rwanda, Burundi, and we see another situation unfolding right now in South Sudan. We have a situation in Cameroon. We have horrific conditions in Haiti. But this situation in Gaza, because it has been long festering, because people know that the Palestinian people have been waiting or not waiting for many, many years for recognition as a Palestinian state, and you have had a very brutal occupation and then blockade. For many reasons, this seems to be the thing that has struck people's conscience. And finally, we have tens of thousands and millions of people in the streets all over the world. So as everyone knows, in the last hours, the ceasefire has ended. Israel once again began carpet bombing northern Gaza. And I saw a post someone put up a few hours ago saying so far 178 Palestinians have been killed today. It's causing a great deal of anxiety and anguish. What's very important to bear in mind is that each of us is here for not a terribly long amount of time in the scope of the 5 billion years or so our planet has been here. So what is it that makes our life important? Is it just our life? The moment history began, the day we were born, and history ends the day we died? Or is it our contribution to immortality? Is it that we are part of the human race, which we hope will not be extinguished, even though with the advent of nuclear weapons, we have the ability to exterminate ourselves. We have the ability to annihilate every living thing on this planet. So what is it that makes a particular life significant? And then how is it that we can make sure that those lives which are lost, which are stopped too early, too soon, are still worthwhile? And that's what we have to do today. Now, there is a movement afoot, which in a very real sense came from the spark of the American Revolution, the first successful anti-colonial revolution, which succeeded in establishing a republic against the British Empire, a republic based on documents which express true principles such as every human being, every man is created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is universally true. That doesn't mean that our republic has perfectly recognized that truth or acted upon it, and lately, frankly, has been rather bad. We had moments of progress, moments of regression, those of the view of the British Empire of Zeus versus Prometheus have been very eager to stifle this. But this nation produced a genius named Lyndon LaRouche, who in 1975 wrote a proposal for an international development bank saying we should bring into being the kind of world that John Quincy Adams envisioned, that Franklin Roosevelt imagined should come into existence after World War II. As he told Winston Churchill, we are not defeating fascism, murderous Nazi methods, in order for you to continue your murderous methods in your colonies. And Churchill got very angry and said, well, that would mean the end of the British Empire. It was FDR's strong opinion that every single nation on this earth should have its full independence and sovereignty, which included emphatically economic independence. And LaRouche, a World War II veteran who had no illusions what the death of Franklin Roosevelt would mean for this world, which unfortunately were fulfilled almost immediately by Truman's decision to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan completely unnecessarily. But LaRouche, as a young man, vowed and dedicated his life to ensuring that that world where the perfect sovereignty of every nation would be respected, that every single child born on this planet would have the potential to develop their talents to make a contribution to mankind as a whole. And that really was the mission of the United States of America. But since World War II and the death of FDR, any president who tried to uphold that, and frankly, I guess you could say earlier, because Lincoln was assassinated, Garfield, McKinley were all assassinated, but we had in the 1960s a kind of horrific paradigm shift with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who would have made a very good president, and the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who was likely to become president within a 5-year span. And then a plunge into the Vietnam War, which killed 3 million Vietnamese, 55,000 Americans, but did much more lasting damage to the United States. The generation that served in that war, that fought there and that didn't fight there, was a devastated generation, because also the lie of the Warren Commission, which was that somehow a lone assassin with a magic bullet that went in several different directions somehow killed a beloved president, that lie was allowed to stand, which meant that the agencies that carried out that assassination were allowed to remain in place, dictating American policy. So in 1976, Lyndon LaRouche ran his first presidential campaign. We know already before that the FBI was talking about using the Communist Party to quote unquote eliminate Lyndon LaRouche, and there's much more which I won't go into, but this is critical now because the nations of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS plus now with Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, becoming full members in January, although the recent election in Argentina is probably going to stop Argentina from becoming part of this. But between the BRICS plus, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have an entirely new paradigm coming into being, very much modeled on what Lyndon LaRouche proposed with his International Development Bank in 1975. And therefore, if you want to solve the crisis, if you want not that everyone comes out and demonstrates in the streets until either everyone in Gaza has been dead or removed, or we succeed in stopping the slaughter, and then you go back home. If that's what you want, then you don't need to hear what we're discussing tonight. What I think has to occur is that mankind has to move to a new paradigm, and that the United States has to, I could say return, but we have to go more than return. We have to more fully embody the principles under which we were founded. And Lyndon LaRouche was crucial to that. And so therefore, I wanted to turn it over to two of my colleagues lifelong organizers, associates of LaRouche, who themselves were targeted in various of the witch hunts, arrested, jailed, not as long as some other of our associates, but who know something about this fight, to tell you what's involved, why Henry Kissinger wanted to eliminate LaRouche, and what was behind the witch hunt against LaRouche, so you can understand how to be as threatening to the old order, and hopefully we can become victorious. So that's what I have, and I'm not sure, Elliot Greenspan or Richard Black, which one of you is going to go next, but whichever one it is. Okay, whichever one it is, please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Well, why don't I start? Can you see me okay?
Yes.
Very good. Diane has often said in her campaigning that her leading qualification to run for U.S. Senate is her 30-some-odd-year association with Lyndon LaRouche, essentially as a co-thinker of Lyndon LaRouche. And I very much appreciate that. Richard and I have the same qualification, a little longer. What we're committed to doing here, what I think is appropriate to advance in terms of this discussion, what we want to take up. And I'll say that Lynn and Helga will be joining us, so to speak, via certain testimony which they gave a little less than 30 years ago on the matter. We'll get to that. But one way I would think about this is with the long overdue demise of Kissinger, joining Satan back in hell, you have a process that we have been building, we've been organizing for decades, for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. And you'll see the elements of this in a few minutes as we unfold it. But think of it in terms of long overdue justice for Lynn and Lynn's ideas, as his policies, as his courage and leadership manifest through what Helga's doing through the International Schiller Institute, the International Peace Coalition, what Diane's doing as his representative, the representative of Lynn and the LaRouche movement in this country, in terms of providing an indispensable leadership of the United States at a time when the so-called leadership in Washington its morality is not so removed from Kissinger's depth of immorality over many decades. In any case, we have an historic task of providing justice for Lynn and his ideas, while Kissinger and his so-called ideas join him in the grave. And if you locate this historically, I think you can see clearly the centrality over about 60 years, from about the time of the Kennedy assassination, of the rise, the development of science, of statecraft, of culture, uniquely by Lynn. At the same time that Kissinger comes to power in that period in the 60s, then with Nixon, with Ford as the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the major domo, the leading diplomat in history, and all of this stuff, which was in fact deployed by empire, in this case by the British Empire. So with that said, go back to, Diane referenced Roosevelt and Churchill, and Roosevelt's commitment through the war and with the post-war institutions that he created for the purpose of justice for the developing nations of the world. And the use, the deployment of America's industrial and economic power, as during the war, in a post-war period, to export the capital goods, the infrastructure, the technologies needed throughout the old colonial world, to end colonialism. Churchill was violently opposed. You had the unfolding of the process with the non-aligned nations movement, 1955 and so on, in terms of this desire for freedom based on development, peace based on development of nations, based on cooperation between Africa, Asia, Ibero-America with US and a rebuilt, reconstructed Europe. Kennedy was moving in that direction. They killed him for it. Lynn began building this movement by 1965 because the leadership, competent leadership of the United States was a Rooseveltian orientation, was under huge attack. One thing after another, all the assassinations in the 60s and much beyond that. What Lynn saw coming with the end of the post-war Bretton Woods monetary system in August of 1971 under Nixon and company. Lynn saw a policy of increasing fascist economic austerity with the end of a fixed exchange rate dollar-gold system, which was established at Bretton Woods for the purpose of optimizing production and trade in physical goods, so that the developing nations of the world had the basis to overcome the enslavement, the backwardness, the poverty, etc. Lynn forecast austerity, financial speculation, genocide, menticide, and war, including the growing danger of nuclear war. And he began to organize as this movement movement which he initiated in the mid-60s, as the movement began developing in the 1970s. And he put forward a series of policy initiatives, which we'll reference. I want to reference some of this, and Lynn and Helga will reference more in a few minutes. But simultaneously, what Lynn forecast was being carried forward and implemented by this satanic fascist Kissinger. And Richard had suggested that he wanted to focus in on a leading expression and policy initiative of Kissinger as a way to unfold this point.
The period that we're in is a revolutionary period. Russia, working with scientists in Bolivia, have set up for the population of Bolivia a nuclear science health system. In Egypt, they're building a 4-unit nuclear power plant. China has lifted 850 million people out of extreme poverty. This is more important for Africa than it is for China. I can tell you that this has inspired young intellectuals and leaders across the globe that this giant population bomb, China, 1.4 billion people, is now the most prosperous economy in the world. How is that possible? Well, they murdered Jack Kennedy, but he's not dead. They murdered Martin Luther King, but he's not dead. They murdered Malcolm X, but he's not dead. They're alive today in our movement, in the LaRouche movement, from the standpoint of the global revolution that's occurring. There's an entirely new banking system. Think of how many times you've thought about, you looked at your wallet or your credit card and you say, this banking system is really horrible. Well, you know what? The majority of the world's population agrees, and the new international banking system is being organized. There's conference after conference, month after month. And what is the engine of that transformation? It's the former colonial sector, which was the target of Kissinger's genocidal policies. And that's what I'm going to focus. So there was a battle. There was a battle between what LaRouche, as a young man, initiated in the 60s, as Diane and Elliot both referenced, from the standpoint of a new monetary system, which Lyndon outlined in 1975 with the IDB proposal, the International Development Bank. This was taken up by the entire colonial sector at a big international conference in '76 in the Third World in Colombo, Sri Lanka. and has been moving ever since. And there were more assassinations in Pakistan, in India, throughout Africa. But what happened was LaRouche wouldn't give up. He had methodological optimism about the nature of the human race and the fact that the human race could come out of a period of attack into a new paradigm, as Helga LaRouche has referred to it again and again. Now, there was something published in 1974 to give you a distaste of Kissinger's thinking. It was called National Security Study Memorandum 200. How many people have heard of that? National Security Study Memorandum 200. Has anybody downloaded it and read it? It's worth doing. It was written in 74 when Kissinger was Secretary of State under President Ford. It was declassified in the early 90s, and it is a prescription for genocide. The British East India Company, the author of the Opium Wars against China, the famines against Ireland, the genocide against India, had nothing on Henry Kissinger. And as Elliot has often mentioned, Kissinger said when he was in power in Washington, before he spoke to the president, to the White House, he first consulted with the British Embassy. And after talking to the British Embassy, think British East India Company, then he implemented British policy. So this is the report. National Security Study Memorandum 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interest, in parentheses, the Kissinger Report. So it's famous that this was Kissinger's baby. And, Wikipedia, which is something I really don't like, but just for curiosity's sake, when Diane asked me to talk about this today, I said, well, what does Wikipedia have to say about the Kissinger Report? So this is like every man's knowledge, right? Here's what they say. The memorandum and subsequent policies developed from the report were observed as a way that the United States could use human population control to limit the political power of underdeveloped nations, to ensure the easy extraction of foreign natural resources, prevent young anti-establishment individuals from being born, and to protect American businesses abroad from interference from nations seeking to support their own growing populations. So this is acknowledged. Now, because it's not every day in the New York Times or online or CNN, but this is not a secret. Targeted were 13 nations, and they named the nations. Now, think of a world map in your mind's eye. Listen to where these nations are. Think of the color of the skin of the people in these nations. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, Philippines, Thailand, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, Colombia. They were all targeted for population reduction in order to keep the political and military atmosphere controlled so that multinational corporations could continue to suck raw materials, depending on the dollar, out of these nations, because that was the lifeblood of the northern profit system. In this report, they go into some detail. Oh, yes. This is from the report itself. So this is the Kissinger team writing in 74. The U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad, especially from less developed countries. That fact gives the U.S. enhanced interest in the political, economic, and social stability of the supplying countries. Wherever a lessening of population pressures through reducing population rates, this can increase the prospects for such stability. Population policy becomes relevant to resource supplies and to the economic interests of the United States. The location of known reserves of higher grade ores of most minerals favors increasing dependence of all industrialized regions on imports from less developed countries. The real problems of mineral supplies lie not in basic sufficiency, but in the political economic issues of access. Meaning these nations, those 13 I mentioned, ought to be maintained as colonies. And if you read the report, they take as an axiom, as a given, starvation, mass disease, famine as a unchangeable fact of life. So while Lyndon LaRouche was outlining a concept, a principle, the necessity of progress, if any society, north, south, east, west, is to prosper, then scientific and technological innovation has to be the basis of its economic policy and its growth policy. Without science, there's no life. Resources are always fixed. Fixed amount of coal, fixed amount of water, fixed amount of this, fixed. The only thing that changes it is innovation. Where does innovation come? The human mind. The human mind, the source of science, the ability to conceptualize principles which you can't touch, you can't feel, you can't smell, but they're more powerful than anything physical. The human mind discovers the invisible, those principles which allow us to transform nature. And this has really been the basis of LaRouche's polemic that the world as a whole can be brought up and the age of colonialism can be made to be over. Well, now we can know it is over. A few minutes before we gathered here, I got a press release from the science and technology team at the Chinese consulate, that half a mile from here on 42nd Street. So they sent me a press release. They've just started something new called the International Science and Technology Cooperation Initiative. International Science and Technology Cooperation Initiative. So in the press release, they say, this is just released, science, technology, and innovation is an important engine for the development of human society and an important means to address global challenges. And then they go on through a series of points saying that science and technology is the basis for advancement today, and it's the basis of Chinese society. In this report, they're quite explicit. And they say, what we're looking at across the globe, this is 74, is a Malthusian situation. And people may have looked into this. Parson Malthus, associated with the British East India Company in the 1700s, said falsely, lyingly, that population growth will always expand geometrically, agricultural development arithmetically, so you'll have cycles of famine, disease, and depopulation, and that's the nature of things. As a matter of fact, as you may recall, what he prescribed as social policy in London is that the slums be packed more together, that clean water not be allowed in the hands of the poor, because that could cull off sections of the population and keep the London population stable. This is bestial. This is Nazi stuff. This is Henry Kissinger. And what's happened from the period of the 50s and the 60s, when the idea in the global South was it's time for liberation. It's time that the slavery be turned around. There has been a process over the last 50 years, which has now emerged in a global majority. And who are the big boys in the global majority? China, 1.4 billion people. Russia, who in a couple of months, we celebrate the 300th anniversary of the founding of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Those are the big boys. But joining with them are Brazil, another one, South Africa. This is India. This is extraordinary. India is on the moon. India, think of India under the British rule, and India is now on the moon. So my message is that Kissinger is dead, but the ideas of Lincoln, the ideas of Martin Luther King, the ideas of Jack Kennedy are very much alive in what we're doing today. In the late 70s, as part of this process, we had a conference, a science association associated with LaRouche forces. We had a conference in Paris called The Industrialization of Africa. This was published in 1980. And there were dozens of speakers from Africa, from Europe, from the United States, keynoted by Lyndon LaRouche. And here were the title of the speeches. This is 1979. Reviving the tradition of city building in Africa, the lessons of the Arab Renaissance, the prevention of epidemics in Africa, the role of agro-nuplexes in African development, money in Africa, energy economy. You get the idea. This book is a series of blueprints for the transformation of Africa, which was at the same time being slated for extinction by Henry Kissinger. This period of the 70s was extremely important, both because it set LaRouche up to unleash a world movement, which meant the end of Henry Kissinger, which is one of the main reasons why Kissinger and the caste that he represented said, we have to exterminate Lyndon LaRouche, get him out of here. His ideas are too dangerous. Interestingly to me, at the same time, in that period of the 70s, there was another genius of an intellectual from Senegal, Cheikh Anta Diop. This is a wonderful little book, if people haven't read it, called Black Africa. He was a radiologist. He got his training at the Curie Institute in Paris. He was a genius of not just a thinker, an anthropologist, a historian. And writing about Africa in I think this was 1978, he wrote the following. So this is Cheikh Anta Diop, 1978. That's a long time ago. The form of energy eventually replacing oil in the semi-arid Mideast will not be nuclear fission, for fissionable resources from the Earth will give out at about the time that the petroleum supplies are depleted, to say nothing of the special inconvenience represented by a nuclear power plant existing beyond its use. The substitute energy will very probably be thermonuclear, that is, nuclear fusion, or else solar. We have seen that if this is the case, Black Africa, with its hydroelectric installations, might be the inexhaustible source both for heavy hydrogen, which is the raw material for thermonuclear reactors, and for the future vector of energy as a whole. It goes on from there. Talking about the industrialization of Africa in 1979, Cheikh Anta Diop says, a rational industrialization program would consist first of all of the harnessing of the immense sources of energy which nature has given to Africa, and thus making possible the whole process of development. In the beginning is energy, all else flows therefrom. While exploitation of such abundant energy might become a marketing challenge for private corporations, to a developing country which must stimulate manifold activities and bring into being the apparatus needed for its emergence into the industrial era, the idea of excess energy is pure nonsense. So let's see. This was in the 70s. So you had the 80s, the 90s, the zeros, now we're 2023. Africa is still starving to death. There are 2 billion people in the world that have no access to clean water. There are 800 million people in Africa have no access to electricity. How is that possible? Well, LaRouche said, don't stand for this. Educate yourself, inform yourself. Don't make a virtue of your ignorance. Don't say, well, I don't know. I don't know is not an excuse. You were born to know. And that vector of the power of the human mind, the importance of physical science as a spiritual power, that's now been unleashed. So Henry Kissinger is dead, and he's dead. Global South, which now rightly Foreign Minister LaRouche calls the global majority. So I would suggest when you go home, if you can't sleep at night, Google National Security Study Memorandum 200 and take a look at it. This Kissinger doctrine is pure evil, and it has been the policy of the North up until this point.
So here's Kissinger in 1974 putting that memorandum forward with the power of what is, in one sense, arguably the most powerful institution of the world, the American presidency as an institution. He's running it. But for whom is he running it? Kissinger famously, in 1982, went to London and gave a speech at the Royal Institute of International Affairs on the 200th anniversary of the founding of the British Foreign Office. And here's what he said, quote, "The British were so matter-of-factly helpful that they became a participant in internal American deliberations to a degree never before practiced between sovereign nations. In my period in office, this is 1969 through 1976, 77, as first National Security Advisor with Nixon, then Secretary of State over two administrations. In my period in office, the British played a seminal role in certain American bilateral negotiations with the Soviet Union. Indeed, they helped draft the key document. In my White House incarnation, then, as National Security Advisor, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department." Now, we're not talking about simply the United Kingdom when we say Britain. We're talking about the system of empire, the system that Schiller discusses in terms of Solon, in terms of Lycurgus of Sparta, as against Solon of Athens. We're talking about the history of imperial systems from Babylon through the British Empire of the last 250 years. That's the system and the master that he was serving, using his power inside the institution of the American presidency. Lynn, knowing all of this, I mean, we knew about the NSSM 200, though it was classified for many years, but we knew enough about it, and Lynn soon thereafter conceptualized what he called the International Development Bank to replace the International Monetary Fund system, to replace monetarism, that is economics as money, money makes money, looting, financial dictatorship by the international banking institutions and related institutions. That system, Lynn proposed a system of physical economic science as the basis for development of all of humanity. April of 1975, Lynn was in Baghdad meeting with Iraqi and other Arab leaders. He then met with Arafat's leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He met with Israeli leaders. Abi Eben was the Israeli UN ambassador and also foreign minister, perhaps. Very prominent Israeli figure. Lynn met with him.
An intellectual.
Lynn met with, Abi Eben famously told Lynn, never underestimate the reality of insanity in politics, insanity in terms of political leaders. Lynn was close to Nachum Goldman, who was the head of the World Jewish Congress. This is in the mid-70s, late 70s period. And he took this idea of the IDB, International Development Bank, around the world. We were organizing for this. Richard and I were on the street in 1975, 1976 with a little green booklet. Quarter? It was a quarter, right? Or was it $1?
50 cents.
50, was it Art? In any case, we were selling this by the bushel load on the streets of the United States. We were circulating it to governments, to diplomats across the world to build the idea. Lynn's first presidential campaign, 75, 76, as an independent Labor Party against Carter and Ford. And Lynn was asked, well, what kind of vote do you have? Said, well, I'm starting with 2 billion votes, billion with a B. He was talking about the population of the developing part of the world, of Africa, Ibero-America, Asia. In August of 76, Richard referenced this, you had the Conference of the Non-Aligned Nations, of the Group of 77, most of the world's nations, headed by Indira Gandhi of India in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and they passed a resolution which was based on Lin's IDB proposal in terms of the development of the generation, the initiation of institutions of credit, an international development bank, instead of a monetary fund to impose every form of looting of human labor and of physical resources, as what Kissinger was demanding. Lin put this thing forward, and most of the world endorsed it in August of 76. And it was brought to the United Nations by the former Justice Minister and Foreign Minister of Guyana, Dr. Frederick Wills, in September of 76, prior to that election. So Lin earned the hatred of Kissinger and of Kissinger's British imperial masters.
He was organizing a slave revolt.
True enough. At the same time, you had the, one fascinating case, it was either late 76, 77, we had organized a conference in Paris, working with a leading diplomatic friend based in Paris, an ambassador from, I think from Iraq, and various other diplomatic leaders from Middle East, Southwest Asia, perhaps from Africa, were invited to Paris to meet with Lin. Lin was there. Thing was ready to go. Henry Kissinger came to town and ordered that this not happen. And I believe the ambassador from Iraq called up Lin and said, "I'm sorry, you have to develop a diplomatic illness." And the conference did not occur. It was one of these, there were many such instances of that sort of thing. Soon thereafter, Lin was organizing a an anti-ballistic missile beam weapon defense. More on that when we get a bit later, and you'll hear what Lin says about it. Soon thereafter, as Lin was in a fight with the International Monetary Fund, with the international banksters, Wall Street, London, and beyond, we recognized that the new opium war, and perhaps you're knowledgeable of what the British Empire did to China in the opium wars from 1840 to 1860, which mass genocidal, menticidal wars to destroy China, which led to what the Chinese called a century of humiliation from about 1840 to 1949, a century of humiliation. Recognizing what the expansion of the drug trade would mean, we looked at what was actually running the drug trade, and we published this book. You see it? Dope Incorporated, the first edition in 1978, Dope Inc., Britain's Opium War Against the United States. There was a subsequent edition called Britain's Opium War Against the World. This one is the third edition. In 1992, Dope Incorporated, the book that drove Kissinger crazy. How does that work? Well, without the drug banks, without Citibank and Chase and Hong Shang, Bank of HSBI, the bank, I'm sorry, HSBC, the Bank of Hong Kong and Shanghai is the way I think of it. Without all of these City of London and Wall Street banks, the drug trade would never have proliferated and exploded in the way that it did. The banks were addicted to the drug money laundering, and we named it. The banks, the people who ran the institutions, and so on. And they went wild. We put this out in 1978, and we sold out 50,000 copies of that book rather quickly before we went into the subsequent editions, translated into various languages. But who then attacked Lin and this movement? Kissinger personally, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith is an old British Freemasonic operation founded in this country in 1843, which was part of the Confederate insurgency to destroy the United States. And it was very much part of the operation which murdered Lincoln, B'nai B'rith, and their people. Anyhow, I won't go through the whole history now. I'll reference a couple of things. But what you have is this is Dope Incorporated. This is the international financial crowd and their protectors. And Kissinger was a leading protector, as was this Anti-Defamation League. We published this little book years later, The Ugly Truth About the ADL. Now, I'll just mention that you've noticed that many Jewish students and Jewish professors and Jewish writers and Jewish thinkers in this country and internationally are under attack because they dare to criticize the Israeli government for Hitlerian genocide in Gaza. Can't do that. That's anti-Semitic. No, it's a criticism of a nation, of a government. This is not a criticism of Judaism in that sense. But Lynn was targeted as a leading anti-Semite because he went after these banksters, some of whom were Jewish, and he went after some of the leading Zionist lobby characters, Edgar Bronfman of Seagram's, Max Fisher. You may or may not know these names going back to the 70s and subsequent. And he was going after the an international cabal, which was in part nominally Jewish. You know, Jews have the right to run drugs, don't they? Can't Jews be banksters? Well, some were. How dare you attack a Jew? By the way, my middle name is Israel, but we could go into that if you want. In any case, in that same period, we published a document which was called Zionism is Not Judaism. Or was it the other way around? Yeah. Zionism is not Judaism. Think about how that's played over the last months. The ADL has been centrally involved in the smear campaign today against a whole lot of thousands and thousands of young Jews and older Jews and so on who they may love Israel, but they recognize Israel is self-destructing by carrying out a policy of mass genocide against an occupied, oppressed population. This crowd went wild to destroy LaRouche. One of their favorite smears, this is the of this Dope Incorporated ADL crowd. One of their journals called High Times, you may have heard of it, the unofficial house organ of the dope lobby, put out an article, this is in that period, late 70s, under the headline, War on Drugs, the strange story of Lyndon LaRouche, sinister mastermind of the National Anti-Drug Coalition. They want to take your drugs away, end quote. This is the American dope lobby, the ADL, which recognized that what LaRouche did with the publication of Dope Inc. and then the creation of the national and international anti-drug movement is he was actually organizing the basis to politically defeat this explosion of dope. And he did this from the standpoint of reorganizing the international financial system, the international economy, and to defeat this opium war, this menticidal attack against the American people, young people especially, and against much of humanity. And they hated him for it, because empires cannot rule if you've got a population capable of thinking and organizing politically. One more thing for the moment on the ADL, we can take up much more when we finish, but just in the introduction to this book, The Ugly Truth About the ADL, there were a whole series of investigations of the ADL going back to the 90s, and what they were, not simply our investigation, sorry, but this is by police investigators in San Francisco. ADL caught on illegally spying on at least 950 political organizations, including the NAACP, Greenpeace, Simon Wiesenthal Center, the United Auto Workers, New Jewish Agenda, Liberty Lobby, Nation of Islam, the United Farm Workers, American Civil Liberties Union, Political Movement of Lyndon LaRouche, and much more. Okay, what I want to do is just go to the video material, because this LaRouche case, which in the 1984 presidential campaign, Lynn was on national television 16 times, 30 minutes each, primetime network television. And the LaRouche movement was building the kind of political strength which terrified Kissinger, the dope lobby, the banksters, so on and so forth. At the end of the campaign, a grand jury was impaneled. Richard and I were before that grand jury 19 times between us in 1985. And Richard and I were two of the initial dozen who were indicted on October 6, 1986. The first mass indictment of LaRouche associates to try to destroy this movement. I won't elaborate on that for time reasons. But in the course of the fights which ensued, we generated a huge international movement for justice, for exoneration for Lynn. There were hearings initiated by the Schiller Institute in 1995, independent hearings to investigate misconduct by the U.S. Department of Justice in a number of cases, particularly of Black elected officials in the United States, Operation Frew mentioned, and the LaRouche case, and others. And I want to show you some of Lynn in those hearings, and then some of Helga in those hearings, for them to do in their own words, to communicate to you guys in the room and to those watching how Lynn and Helga thought about the injustice, the cause of the attacks, and so on. Mike, Dave.
During the 1970s, until the end of COINTELPRO, we were constantly beset by the FBI. Our main weapon against the FBI was jokes. We used to make some jokes about the FBI, which we would pass around to try to persuade them to keep off our tail, but they kept coming, and all kinds of harassment. Then in 1982, there was a new development. I sensed it happening, but I received the documents later. The events which led to what I would call a fraudulently obtained indictment and conviction and incarceration. It started, according to the record, of which I had some sensibility this was going on at the time, of Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, with whom no love was lost between us. Went to William Webster and others soliciting an FBI or other government operation against me and my associates. This led, as the record later showed, to a decision by Henry Kissinger's friends on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board recommending an operation against me and my associates. This was adopted during the same month of January by Judge Webster, the director of the FBI, who passed the implementation of this instruction along to his subordinate, Oliver Buck Revell, recently retired from the FBI, I believe. And the first inkling I had of this was in about April of 1983, at which time a New York banker, who is very intelligence-witting, shall we say, a private bank of Smith and Train in New York City, held a salon at which various government agents, private individuals, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, and also NBC TV News, the Reader's Digest, the Wall Street Journal, and others were represented. The purpose was to coordinate an array of libels, a menu of libels, which would be commonly used by the news media in an attempt to defame me and hopefully, from their standpoint, to lead to criminal action against me and my associates. In January of 1984, this attack came into the open, launched by NBC TV, which had been a participant in this salon of trains, which launched the pattern, which was the pattern of coverage by all U.S. news media, major news media, and many minor news media, from the period of January, the end of January 1984, through the end of 1988. I saw no case of any significant coverage of me or mention of me in the U.S. print media, particularly the major print media, the Associated Press in particular, which was an active part of the prosecution, in fact, or in the national television media, network media especially. Not a single mention of me which did not conform to the menu of libels concocted by this salon, which had been established under John Train as part of this operation. This salon, including the Anti-Defamation League, NBC, TV, others, the Associated Press, actively collaborated, beginning sometime in 1984, with forces inside the government which were determined to have a criminal prosecution against me and my associates. The motivations of the case against us, I think, are in part obvious, perhaps partly not. In 1982-83, there were two things which greatly excited my enemies. Number one, I had been involved in 1982 in presenting a proposal which is based on my forecast in the spring of 1982 that a major debt crisis would break out in South America, Central America, and the expectation that Mexico would be the nation that would have a debt crisis. I've been involved with many of these countries and personalities in them in projecting alternatives to this kind of inequitable system where colonial nation had been replaced as a term by debtor nation. And the debt of South America, Central America was largely illegitimate, that it was a debt which had not been incurred for value received, but had been done under special monetary conditions under the so-called floating exchange rate system, where somebody would come, bankers would come to a country, the IMF in particular, and say, we just wrote down the value of the currency, we're now going to refund your financing of your foreign debt, which you can no longer pay on the same basis as before. So I propose that the debt crisis be used as the occasion for united action by a number of governments of South and Central American countries to force a reform in the international debt relations and to force a reform within international monetary relations. This report was entitled Operation Juarez, largely because of the relationship of President Lincoln to Mexico during the time that Lincoln was president, with the idea that it was in the interest of the United States to accept and to sponsor such a reform, to assist these countries in the freedom to resume development of the type which they had desired. And this report was published in August of 1982, ironically a few weeks before the eruption of the great Mexico debt crisis of '82, and was presented also to the U.S. government, the National Security Council, for the President's information at that time. There was some effort on the part of the President of Mexico to implement my proposal in the initial period of the debt crisis. He had at that time some support from the President of Brazil and the government of Argentina. But under pressure from the United States, the government of Brazil and Argentina capitulated, and President Jose Lopez Portillo, the President of Mexico, was left, shall we say, hanging out to dry. As a result, in October of 1982, he capitulated to the terms which were delivered to his government and people around him by people such as Henry A. Kissinger, who made a trip to Mexico at that time to attempt to intimidate the Mexicans to submitting to these new terms. This was one issue between me and Kissinger and his friends. The second issue was that sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1982 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with. On the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense, which I had this proposal which the president adopted, at least initially, in the form of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by the president on March 23rd, 1983, there were a lot of people out for my scalp. Those are the at least contributing factors in what happened to me. But they may not be all. There probably are others as well. My case may be, as Ramsey Clark described it, the most extensive and the highest level of these cases in terms of the duration and scope of the operation, which came to involve the Soviet government. It came to involve the East German Stasi intelligence service. It involves collaboration between the Department of Justice and the Stasi in the case of Palmer's murder case. It involved direct collaboration between, as I say, the Soviet government, the Soviet press, particularly from about off and on Andropov beginning the 1984. And then when Gorbachev came in again, 85 to 86 into 88, the Soviet press vilification of me in collaboration with the same line as the US press exceeded that of anything since Stalin's time in the Soviet press against any private individual in history. And it was part of the same operation. So my case is important in the sense it's more extensive, it's more deep-going, long-going. But when it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it.
But the lack of the ability to have important ideas govern history, that is the biggest crime. And Lin, while he was incredibly courageous of producing creative work when he was in prison, I mean, he did more in prison than any of us outside, and he put us to shame. But nevertheless, I will only give you one example. In 1989, he was already in jail for nearly 1 year when the borders of Europe opened. He, from his prison cell, designed a great vision how to integrate Eastern Europe, Western Europe, China, the whole Eurasian continent, which would have been a groundbreaking conception which would have put the entire history of the 20th century on a totally new basis. Because economically, to integrate that economic space as one, would have given opportunities and freedom to the states of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the Asian countries. And he designed such a plan, which we presented, and which now, in the meantime, is practically as an alternative on the table in Russia, in Ukraine, in the European Union. But because Lin was in jail, this idea did not become as effective as if he would have been free. And instead, you had Bush and Thatcher organizing the Balkans War, the Gulf War, imposing austerity conditions on Eastern Europe, with the result that Russia today is becoming a horrible place of big danger and anti-Western sentiment, which potentially could lead to World War III down the road. Now, I'm saying this because, to put a man of great ideas into jail is a crime all by itself because of the ideas. The reason why we were able to mobilize hundreds of parliamentarians and thousands of VIPs from around the globe, why would people from Africa sign the parole request for Lyndon LaRouche? Why would people from Latin America do this? Why would people from around the world, from Russia, why would people come out of completely different cultural worlds to fight for this man? Well, because we not only said this man must be free and his innocence must be proven, but many of them told me and others that they understand that the kind of change in global policy my husband is standing for, the kind of just new world economic order which allows the economic development of Africa, which allows the economic development of the developing countries of Eastern Europe, they say is the only hope for them, for their nation, as far away as it may be. So the reason why we must win is not because it's a personal affair. But as my husband was saying, we are going into a period of crisis which most people are completely unaware of. The kinds of changes have to be big, and they have to be done with the help of the United States, because the world cannot be saved against the United States. If you have a fascist president in the United States from 96 onward, my hopes that the rest of the world will make it are very slim. So it is a historical necessity, and I think that in a certain sense, given the experience I have from 8 years of fighting this, given the fact that more and more people around the globe are united around this and understand that mankind is really sitting in one boat this time, that either we solve all our problems at once or nobody will live, I think we can win, and I think we must have that attitude.
No, I'd like to see if Diane has any thoughts she wants to bring in here and open it up for people here and so on. I have some other things, but let's hold on that.
Well, maybe you should go ahead, or people have questions there. I'm hoping that, it's interesting to watch this again. I have to say, I had totally forgotten about the NBC business in 1984. Of course, I hadn't yet associated myself with LaRouche at that time, but it really is what Ramsey Clark said. This was an ongoing long witch hunt. The other thing that was striking to me from the beginning of your comments, the Dope Inc. question, the Anti-Defamation League. You remember when Lynn was in prison, he wrote this little paper that said, "I have no enemy who is not evil." And he said, "I'm really happy to see that everyone who is opposed to me is really evil." And that's what you see with Kissinger and these, they were just filthy crooks, disgusting, despicable, criminal minds who had absolutely no qualms about doing anything underhanded, illegal, sadistic, or whatever. And I think it's useful for people to have a sense of that as well. And to not be pessimistic, because everything is now coming to a head, but Americans would be much better off and much better prepared were they familiar with the life's work of Lyndon LaRouche and this movement. And I think that's something we have a real job to do to get this out to people.
Let me add two things briefly, and then people will have some thoughts, I'm sure. Ramsey Clark, who was the Attorney General of the United States in the mid-late 60s in the Johnson administration, who then became, he was sort of at odds with Lynn for years and we were certainly critical of Ramsey and vice versa. He became Lynn's attorney on appeal from the federal prosecution. But Ramsey also testified, you heard Helga's reference to it, in his testimony at that same hearing in 1995, Ramsey said this: "I'll start and end with the case of Lyndon LaRouche and his co-defendants, not because it's the alpha and omega, although it's about as close as a case gets to the potential perfidy of justice, but because it shows how bad it can be, and yet it has, as so very, very few of these cases ever do, a positive side that we have to consider. In what was a complex and pervasive utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy, this case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time, but the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently, this case takes the prize. The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two, but it's a fertile engine of ideas, a common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems, regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost." So there's much more. You might want to see the entire thing. The one other thing I would reference is a few hours ago in the weekly meeting of the International Peace Coalition, which Helga LaRouche initiated in May. Today was the 26th weekly meeting. A Palestinian-American space scientist came on with a comment, and his comment was, said, "My parents are in Gaza. They are trapped. I don't know what I can do." And then he said, "But what you're putting forward here," and he was referring to this, to the LaRouche Oasis Plan, which was presented today in that IPC meeting by Marcia Mary Baker, Hussein Askari, leaders from EIR and our movement. He said, "But these are imperial ideas. We don't want anybody Western with these programs in Palestine. It's all been terrible. These are false hopes, imperial ideas." So that's what he said. Helga came in her closing and said, "I want to sharply counter what this Palestinian space scientist said. I want to challenge him to a debate." And she said, "Because it would be tragic if he does not, and if others do not understand the difference between the British system and the American system. And what we are putting forward here, what Lyndon LaRouche proposed by 1975 and ever since, what Helga has put on the table as the unique pathway toward peace through economic development, these are the ideas of physical economy, the science of physical economy, which Lynn has brought to its height. These are the ideas of the American system as opposed to the IMF and this financial speculation and so on." And she went from there. But I emphasize this because in fighting through what you saw in those hearings, what we have been working on all of these years in securing exoneration, justice for Lynn and his ideas, as against any further power of this Kissingerian financial oligarchy and so on, is we've created the basis for development worldwide, which is proceeding apace with the BRICS, the Belt and Road, and so on, with the Global South. And we bring U.S. and nations of the North into cooperation with that. We have an incredible future. So thoughts, questions for any of us? Yeah.
On Thursday, we had a deployment or rally in front of the British consulate building. Diane joined us a little later today. but early on, I met a woman who was a diplomat, Palestinian diplomat. And she was quite obviously excited about what we were proposing and all that. But she insisted that they don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, which is Palestine. And the Israelis should just get out of there. Now, obviously, this is part of. We met with another guy today whose family is Palestinian. He was born here, and of course, he had the same kind of response in the sense that they reject this idea of a two-state solution. And how would this actually be? I mean, the Chinese were very emphatic that it had to be a two-state solution. Theoretically, the U.S. is supporting a two-state solution, right? Supposedly, this was part of the UN Charter resolution from 1948 on. So, what is the actual? What do we actually think we can do?
Lynn often emphasized that those who say, let us have peace in the Middle East or wherever, and the adversaries will get together and establish peace. Lynn said, it doesn't work through politics, political negotiation first. You have to lay a foundation for it, whereby the adversaries, the enemies, could come together, recognizing and negotiating and developing a foundation to live together. Whether it's one state or two states, you have to define the common interests, the benefit which would come from such negotiation, so on. That's, in other words, physical economy first, then the political question. And what we have brought into, you look at the Chinese initiative for an international peace conference, and that's the leading edge of what you have before the world. A peace conference is essential. But I think where the weakness comes in is the Chinese can put that forward because they've transformed their own economy and much of the world economy. And therefore, they have tremendous weight behind that proposal. Others should think through how the Palestinians and the Israelis could actually live together, whether it's side by side in two states or together in one state. But from my standpoint, that's the secondary question. That's what everyone has been focused on this for a long, long time. Lynn developed the science of physical economy and the OASIS plan and the IDB. And that's why they attacked him in this way. That's where our work becomes so decisive. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's a concrete process afoot. A large group of Arab nations, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, is in a significant organizing drive for a ceasefire and for negotiations. This has been going on for several weeks. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang received a large group of Arabic nations the day before the big Security Council meeting at the UN. And there was an extensive discussion about how to proceed, who would sponsor such a conference, how the conference what the makeup would be from the standpoint of a ceasefire and opening negotiations. That's the first part, and that's functioning now. After this group of Arab nations met with Wang Yi, who brings tremendous gravitas to this extremely difficult problem, after this large group of Arab nations met with Wang Yi, they said to the international media, this meeting today with China was phase 2. Phase 2 is when our representatives went to Beijing a month ago and talked about moving the process forward. So there's a real live organizing process as to what will be the shape of this peace conference. And this is heavily being discussed among the Arabic-speaking nations. And of course, China has had a positive relationship with Israel over a long period of time. And when I asked a Chinese official about a month ago, I said, how were you able to bring together Saudi Arabia and Iran? He said, well, first we had to establish between these two enemies a new intent to explore possibilities. Once that intent was identified in each of them, Then we had to organize them around the positive economic benefits to each in moving forward. Once we were in the discussion about joint economic benefits, then we were able to talk about a unified approach. So the Chinese have tremendous authority, having done what I said earlier. They had 850 million people in extreme poverty, and they lifted all of them out a year earlier than they said they would. That was done by 2020. This has tremendous, tremendous weight. And the fact that they say, look, we want economic development, and we're not interested whether you're Saudi Arabia and you're a kingdom, or whether you're another nation and you call yourself socialist, and you're another nation and you call yourself a Venezuelan communist. We don't care what you call yourselves. We don't care how you organize yourself. We know you're people. People are people. All human beings need the same thing. They need to educate the mind. They need to move the spirit. They need water, they need food. So we proceed from there, as Alec was saying. So as you're thinking about this, when you hear about organizing for a peace conference, it's easy to be cynical about governments because the governments in the West are so rotten. But if you look at nations of the world looking at China, China has immense authority. They created a miracle, an absolute miracle in the last 40 years. So this is a real process going on. I don't know exactly how it's going to occur. I know one Chinese that I spoke to said one of the problems we have to solve is frictions within the Arabic-speaking nations themselves. If we can get a more unified approach, that will help us advance the whole process. Now we're talking about a matter of days, not a matter of months. So rather than being abstract, two state, one state, I'm for this, there's a real organizing process going on, which has the potential of resolving the situation. And the Chinese are smart. A month ago, they held a day-long session of the Security Council, and the Chinese ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Zhang, he said, well, you know, the UN was built on 3 pillars. The pillars were peace, development, and human rights. But he said the master key is development. It defines everything else. Now, among all the governments in the world, China comes the very closest to the conceptions of physical economy and transformation and the measure of economic value to the original contributions of Lyndon LaRouche. So don't underestimate the Chinese. They're up to making miracles. Of course, we have something important to contribute beyond that. I think the conception of a new paradigm of international relations, as Helga writes about it and describes it, has certain metaphysical elements that the Chinese do not bring forward. But this process, I think, has a lot of potential. God help us, it has a lot of potential.
Robert,
So
did you?
I can't see wait, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Can we see it?
Yes.
Okay, because we really have to wrap up, and also the room is supposed to be done at 9:30. So, yeah.
What time is it?
I just want to make a couple points, and then I know there are people there, and maybe you can talk after we close the live stream. One, I think the point, well, there's a couple things to consider on the question of 1 versus 2 state solutions. One obvious one is you have UN Resolution 242, which is the last thing that the world agreed upon, which is a 2-state solution. Also, why is Al-Sisi, the Prime Minister of Spain, the Prime Minister of Belgium, talking about recognizing a Palestinian state? It's a real problem if you're defined merely as an occupied territory. What is your standing in the world? What does it mean that Palestine does not have a seat as a nation in the United Nations? Now, there's a lot to be said about reforming the order of the United Nations so it is more equitable and more reflective of the actual dynamic in the world today. But I think this does underscore the necessity of there being a Palestinian state. And I think if you're going to have one state, and I've heard many people argue for it, I know that's the position of some people, including many, I think, younger Jewish people in the United States. Why do we need a religious state, Israel? Why don't we have a state which is not a religious state where people are equal citizens? If you consider, I know Bibi Netanyahu apparently has a 4% approval rating right now, so he probably isn't the best representative of the view of the majority of the people of Israel in terms of his butchery of people in Gaza, but are they prepared to completely fundamentally change what they consider the identity of Israel? Or I don't think we're there yet. That might shift if you have the kind of development that's proposed. So I think that there is a need to put the question of a two-state solution on the table emphatically, with the recognition of Palestine, a Palestinian state, with the rights that go with that, including the question of self-determination and form of government and other aspects. And clearly, the biggest problem in the world, which is what I want to get to, and what we're sitting in right now in the United States, is the United States. If the United States is run by a group of insane, delusional people who are either on too many drugs or not enough drugs, then it's very hard for the rest of the world to function. If the United States were working together with Russia and China, who, in spite of major differences, Richard just made the point about the differences among the nations of the BRICS. Russia and China have very different histories, very different forms of government, very different cultures, but they are clearly cooperating in strategic affairs. If the United States would stop being the ally of the British imperial system and return to its anti-colonial revolutionary identity, and therefore be able to work in accord with China and Russia, many of these other problems, in fact, I think there's not any problem on the planet that could not be figured out peacefully. And that's the job really that we have to do. And that's the job of my campaign for US Senate. And at the moment, my campaign for US Senate is the highest level campaign in the country, where you have a voice for a strategic policy in the world that makes sense and that is coherent with these principles. You don't have it from Biden, you don't have it from Trump, and you don't have it from Robert Kennedy Jr. But we have this tradition in my campaign for US Senate from New York, and that's the significance of it. And I just would like to say in closing that this Sunday from 3 to 6 p.m., there's a statewide meeting of the campaign centrally located in the Syracuse area. There will be a Zoom session of that from 4 to 6 p.m. If you go to the website, sarahforsenate.com, you may RSVP if you want to get to Syracuse, or to go in person, or to get the Zoom link to become part of this. And I also would like to reiterate what I said in the beginning, that I hope no one listening to this is planning to stop marching and stop organizing when we stop the slaughter of the Palestinian people. We need much more than that. We need to finally get to the point where this never happens again. So I think we will wrap up the live stream part of this. I would like to thank you, Elliot Greenspan, Richard Black, two of my dear friends and colleagues with whom we have been in this fight for a long time. And I hope that everybody watching resolves that you are going to join us in this. So that's what I have, and thank you very much.